Okay, today we are going to look at the beginning, at least, of our discussion of Cold War dictatorships. So the background here, with the success of the Cuban Revolution and its push toward the Soviet Union as a process of radicalization due to U.S. policy, remember back in the Cuban Revolution lesson, the U.S. refuses to buy Cuban sugar, so the Cubans nationalize the sugar industry. The U.S. refuses to refine Soviet oil, so the Cubans seize the the American oil refineries in Cuba. All of this, keep in mind, confirms the worst fears of the United States government, that the Soviet Union is looking to establish Latin America, a series of satellite states inside of Latin America. In other words, countries that are willing to do the will of the Soviet Union. Now, the simple fact is that it is not Soviet communism that is driving most of these changes, most of the resistance, rather, to U.S. intervention. Instead, it's nationalism. Basically, people, you remember 1930s, 1940s, this feeling of nationalism, it doesn't go away just because of the end of the end of the Second World War. And so it's really nationalism and an overall resentment toward the elite, the inability of large numbers of people still to get out of poverty, the reactionary nature of the elite. That's really what's driving Latin America toward the Marxist camp at this point. But the United States sees any of this as being an example of communism. This kind of black and white vision of the U.S. government helps make this rather unfortunate period of Latin American history happen. So, in reaction to the Cuban Revolution, the United States begins to actively train, equip, pay Latin American militaries to begin to deal so that they can deal with communists in their own borders. Unfortunately, Latin American militaries internalize this vision of anything socialism equals communism. Any support of redistribution of wealth, or in helping out the poor is communism. Any resistance to American influence, well, that's communism too. Latin American military really internalizes this U.S. view, and it leads to some very, very brutal repression of any elements inside of the society that the regime is unsure about. Being even just a leftist, not agreeing with the government, makes you a communist. And as we'll talk about, people get disappeared, tortured, killed, becomes very, very common in Latin America. All of this is with U.S. backing. And Latin American militaries, along with that, they become increasingly involved in the business of governing. Their power, as their resources, thanks to the United States, increases, their powers in their respective countries increase too. And so over time, they begin to question why they need civilian governments at all. Civilians seem to be willing to discuss solutions, to compromise with the communists, where the military sees it. The military just basically says, hey, you know what, if we can get the job done, let's get the job done. And this gives the rise to the idea that the civilians shouldn't even be in government in the first place. And this helps fuel the establishment of dictatorships in many parts of Latin America. And what we'll pick up with the next lecture, we'll talk about examples of those dictatorships and some of the big ideas that we can take away from the dictatorship period.